Then into watts.
Design your own system. Using IPSP means
Where are the following texts? Here. No. Oh. It's the image you're suggesting. Oh yeah, is that how it looks like? Vectosphere. Yeah, I don't know about that. Kind of cute. Who's the guy? It looks good here.
Human form is what it is, and it's the new moon in Gemini on June 6th. Mental pursuits. So this is a great time to put your energy and efforts towards starting something new.
Yeah. Always.
I don't know what much else to say besides.
Best settings. Another good thing would be to get to know your neighbors, because when you know your neighbors, you can establish the kind of trust that I'm talking about when I put my blood in tears. I don't, but you know what I mean. I love newspapers, and somebody puts their kombucha there. It better be good energy, so it will be cleaner and purer when it's coming from your friends, from the apartment next to you. If we're still living in apartment buildings, we're gonna have to figure out the regenerative practices that we're engaged in. It's not going to be that difficult, but there is a lot of relationship creation that needs to be made that maybe not everyone is up to that task, and that's okay. But that's why we got people who are interested in DAOs and network states. Some people are more alpha than others, so those alpha people are going to be the organizers or the members of the board, of the building, and will be creating these kind of circles of people who are residing in the place, in the apartment building, to represent the voices of, everyone who lives there. And if anyone wants to join into this building's board, they're very welcome to do so. It's just, again, not everyone is up for the job of volunteering their time and energy for this type of management work, right? Yet, I believe that would be the key for regenerative practices that we can all get engaged in if we're living in the city. I'm a city girl. I've always lived in the city. I've never really lived on anywhere than the cities unless I was doing my spiritual awakening journey in Southeast Asia and not living in the city. But most of the cases is the city life for me. So I'm coming to you from a perspective of how to optimize your life in the city setting. And for me, again, living in an apartment building and not knowing my neighbors is their life. It makes no sense anymore. I want to know everyone, and I want to have what they're having and share with them what I'm doing, so that we all can engage in inner economy that comes within the community. Yeah, sure, there will be new people coming, people going, but still there will be a flow of knowledge and practices that are agreed upon and shared across the members of this community that is an apartment building. It's quite nice. It's not that hard. That's okay, it's not that hard. It's actually easier than your digital DAOs and crypto shit. That is true.
Занимаюсь стоя, не скрещиваются руки и ноги.
He's a reputable, smart person who's had
who live here, but about
Asia, and
I heard also somewhere that the Latin in South America and even imagine, right? Reviewing the news. We're bored and we kind of moved on.
When you see the world collapsing, it's one of the most positive things you could ever imagine. Although lipids, oil, these are non-polar. And I say water is polar because it's got positive and negative charges that make the molecules line up. Oil is non-polar. I said, guess what? They don't mix because of two different versions of connectivity. A polar molecule uses a different understanding of the mechanics versus a non-polar molecule, okay? So now I go into, so basically cells are made out of lipids and proteins. Proteins have polarity. Lipids have no polarity. I said, well, then when you create a body, it can,
Loves, for me, absolutely not interested in doing any hackathon for these kind of prizes.
Can you do that? I said, well, the silhouette of the body illustrates it. I go, the male is the polarized one. It's got all the muscles. Muscles are polarized. They have one end versus the other end, positive and negative, and there's polarity here, okay? And they connect together in chains and do all this kind of stuff like that. They make structure inside the cell. Polar molecules make the skeleton. Polar molecules make the contraction stuff that allows the cells to move, okay? I said, but what about lipids? Oh, those are the vegetative things. They're the ones that digest food, build the body, create reproduction and all that. I go, well, wait, then a cell has both polar and nonpolar work together in this fashion to make a whole. But when the system started to have lots and lots of cells, it was not efficient that everybody did the same thing. So I said, then what? Well, in a human, the fat of the human body is representative of the nonpolar, okay? And it's energy. First of all, that's where'd you get the energy? From the lipids. that's stored energy, okay? But the muscles and the bones, they're from polarity. So I say, so when you look at a male body, its design is muscles and bone. The physique of the human is more muscle and bone. You look at the silhouette of a woman, and you see there's fat, especially like in the mammary glands and in the body shape. And I go, oh, so a man is the emphasis of polarity. The woman is the emphasis of the vegetative state.
I'm vegetative.
Which will complete the sunrise.
Not yet. Didn't really love building.
That is, and they started in
There's also information on crafted in some shapes and system as well. This would be on the 6th. We've moved ahead to the 6th. And on the 6th, what's significant here is that this new moon in Gemini is closely conjoined with Venus, even though the Venus-Sun conjunction has already occurred. The moon comes sweeping through there just an hour or so after the new moon, and it's very, very, it's a sweet new moon because of the new moon conjoining with Venus. On the other hand, we also have the Sun and Venus making sesqui-squares. That's a square and a half to Pluto. And here we have an important piece coming in that makes this new moon a bit darker than it's going to seem to many astrologers who for some reason ignore the half square and square and a half, which we know not only are real aspects, but are every bit as strong as a square or an opposition, especially when they're exact, and especially when they're picking up on planets that are already square. And what we have here is that this new moon is also square to Saturn, and the moon square Saturn occurs just a couple of hours, maybe 4 hours, 4 or 5 hours after the new moon. And then the sun's square to Saturn occurs on June 9th. We'll get there in just a moment. But we're meeting resistance. We're meeting the old guard. We're meeting we're meeting those people trying to hold on to a status quo that isn't working, and they're going to do that with strength and with authority. And this new moon is also a square and a half to Pluto. And why this is so important, and I know I talked about this last month, is that last month, at the beginning of the month, we had Saturn making its first of 3 exact half squares to Pluto. And that Saturn half square Pluto that was exact on May 6th will be exact again on September 25th, and then again January 26th of 2025. And the Saturn-Pluto square, half square, opposition, square and a half square conjunction, that cycle is really the cycle that is at play when national boundaries rub up against each other. In fact, we know that when planets are making squares or half squares or oppositions or conjunctions to Saturn and to Pluto, especially when they're in a half square themselves, this is the exacerbation of wars, and certainly what's been going on in the Mideast, going back to last October when Mars was squaring Pluto, and then Mars conjoined Pluto, and then the Saturn half square to Pluto the beginning of May and the beginning of the attack on Rafah. And all of this is tied into this new moon, because the new moon is actually forming a square with Saturn and a square and a half with Pluto. And the Saturn-Pluto half square itself is still 2 degrees of orb, and that for a half square, I would use a 3-degree orb as something that would absolutely still be effective. So this is a very, very potent new moon, and it's still important to understand that the Jupiter trine Pluto is still in orb. It's still within a degree of orb at the time of the new moon. And Venus is still at that square and a half point to Pluto, just like the sun is. And Venus and the sun at the new moon are about 1/4 of a degree from being that square and a half to Pluto. So this is an incredibly, incredibly potent period of time, and one that I think that from the new moon on the 6th all the way through the 9th, when the sun finally moves through the square to Saturn, even later on the 6th, when Mercury is making a half square to Chiron, and all of this, the words can cause more damage here than we intend, and I think that we can see some real power plays going on here. These are not easy days, even with all these planets in Gemini. It's like the storms are blowing every which way. You know, the winds of change are blowing, but they're not just blowing in a steady way that we can catch it in our sails and head off into the future. The winds are shifting every few minutes, every few hours, every few days right now. And this energy kind of sticks with us. By the way, as we continue to move forward, on Friday the 7th, we have the moon moves into Leo midday. I'm sorry, on Friday the 7th, the moon moves into Cancer, and that's early in the morning. It's at about 5:40 a.m. On the 7th, and by the time we get to the 8th, we have now Mars, which had been moving toward the latter degrees of Aries. Mars actually on the 8th enters, it enters Taurus. It doesn't do it till 9:34 p.m., but we are going to be feeling this because Mars, even though it's not yet square by sign to Pluto, Mars is moving into a position where it's square to Pluto. And this, once again, is power struggle coming out in the open. It's the anger and the assertion and the aggression of Mars. Mars hot in Aries, but as it gets into Taurus, it digs in its heels and it's holding itself for the long haul. Mars moves into Taurus at 9:34 p.m. on Saturday, June 8th. And at the same time, we have the sun moving toward that square to Saturn. These, again, are tough days because we're going to see real resistance to change, and we're going to see an entrenching of the status quo, and yet we're also going to see the energy that is not going away, pushing up against that and demanding the change, especially since during this period of time on June 9th, the moon actually moves into Cancer, I said on Friday morning, but by the time we get to the 9th, midday on Sunday, the moon moves from Cancer into Leo. And it does it just after noon. So when we look at the noon chart here, we can see that the moon is still at 29 degrees of Cancer, but by 1 p.m., actually by 12:28 p.m., that specific time, of course, the moon moves into Leo. And now we got a situation, because when that moon moves into Leo, and even at that last degree, the moon is moving into that square to Mars, which has just moved into Taurus. And the moon, as it moves into Leo, fixed sign, is opposing Pluto at 1 degree, almost 2 degrees, but 1 degree of Aquarius fixed sign, and squaring Mars, which is squaring back to Pluto at just a half a degree of Taurus. And now we have some real conflict out in the open. The one saving grace is that Mercury, the communicator, moving through mid-degrees of Gemini, is making a sextile and trine to the nodal axis, hopefully relieving some of that pressure from that relationship issue. And we can imagine what those relationships are, whether they are the dilemma of American politics or the dilemma of Mideastern politics, or so many other issues that are cooking around the planet. But that's all leading up to the 9th. By the time that we get to Monday the 10th, we can see that the moon is now moving through mid-degrees of Leo, and Mercury is now moved from that half square to Chiron to the half square with Mars. Again, our words are not healing now. We want them to be, even though Mars is coming into that exact square to Pluto. I mean, it's close already, but it's not exact until Tuesday the 11th. But we have Mercury now at the square and a half point to Pluto, also exact later today, or actually early on the 11th. This is all tough stuff. These are words that don't necessarily have the healing intention that we want, and especially as Mars pushes towards the square to Pluto, and as we move to the 11th, the moon actually moves into Virgo, but not until later this evening at 10:38 p.m. So here we see at midday, the moon still at 24 degrees of Leo. But on the 11th, we have Venus making a sextile with Chiron. There's a bit of softening energy here. Venus is making a sextile with Chiron, and in fact, the sun is coming into a sextile with Chiron. The moon is moving through a trine to Chiron, and therefore a sextile to the sun and Venus. we do get a little bit of reprieve here, but the moon is also making a square to Uranus, and so we have to be careful about pushing our energy too much, too hard, too fast by putting on some sort of display. That would be the moon in Leo of a here I am, here's what's the truth, here's what's going on, and this can be a bit problematic. Also on the 11th, Mercury, as I mentioned before, comes into the exact square and a half to Pluto, as Mars comes into the exact square to Pluto. I just can't see us getting through this period of time without another round of disruption on one level or another. Even language here can be problematic. It runs into walls as as Mercury makes a square to Saturn. Remember that Venus made that square to Saturn back on October 8th. The Sun made the square to Saturn on not October 8th, on June 8th. Venus, let me say that again. Venus made a square to Saturn on June 8th. The Sun made its square to Saturn on June 9th. And now Mercury makes a square to Saturn on June 12th. These are all about authority and about rigid thinking and about not being able to adapt, even though the Gemini planets are all adaptable. There's something here preventing us, and it's the rule that kind of in some way gets in the way, or someone enforcing a rule or authority, whether it's valid or not. As we move on, as we move through the 12th, we're getting the effects of a few kind of easier aspects. As I mentioned earlier, the Sun moves into a sextile with Chiron. Mercury moves into a sextile with Chiron. Now Mercury, and that's on the 12th, and even on the 13th, we can see those sextiles building. The Sun is now sandwiched between Mercury and Venus. There's a lot of Gemini energy going on here. But again, as the moon is moving through Virgo, it opposes Saturn, and there's a bit of squaring energy as the moon opposes Saturn. This is on June 13th, and the moon then will square the Mercury, Sun, and Venus all in Gemini, while the Sun by the 14th actually is conjoined by Mercury in its interior conjunction as it comes across the face of the Sun, or over that same zodiac degree, and that's at 9:32 a.m. Again, communication, intention, willpower here is strong, especially as the moon on Friday morning moves into Libra at 11:12 a.m., and it then forms a trine with Pluto, and then over the hours ahead, it will then form a trine with Jupiter, kind of making a temporary self-sufficient air grand trine, self-referential, closed-circuit thinking, with the moon opposing Neptune. This is a very dynamic aspect. And we also see here that Mars, which remember made its exact square to Pluto on the 11th, by the 14th, Mars is making its exact half square to Saturn, Saturn having made its exact half square to Pluto last month, but it's still being within orb. And again, it's like the conflicts are not dying down. Even though we're moving into new territory, it's almost like the words are getting louder, the bifurcation is getting greater. Mars forming that semi-square with Saturn on the 14th is definitely running into a wall. And although there may be ways to move through it, I'm not sure that we have the facility or the wisdom to actually move through it. Maybe we can, and we do on an individual basis. I think it's important here always to think cosmically, but in acting locally, we can remember that we don't need to get caught up in every external circumstance that we perceive. There are times when inaction inaction isn't quite right, but let's say reserved action because it isn't always best to act in the present moment, but it's always best to act in the right moment. So we do have some of that energy.
I'm going to suggest is that by the time BlackRock arrives and says we're going to KYC everything to the commercial system in a way that generated what you would now call e-commerce. And that system, the e-commerce system, goes on to run the entire world from that point out in terms of retail transactions. That is all that became of cypherpunk. To all intents and purposes, it died either in the late 90s or shortly after 9/11. The whole kind of thing got shut down, and we got a very, very thinned down, stripped out version of the future. So this is I'm going to be of the bridge that we are at relative to Ethereum and Wall Street. Right? The risk is that the 1990s cypherpunk revolution basically winds up as e-commerce, and what will happen to our cypherpunk revolution is that we're going to wind up as another branch of Wall Street. We're just going to wind up becoming the system. And that might make a lot of people very rich, but it's not going to change the world, never mind save it. This, right, comes along and is kind of the midlife kicker, right? Bitcoin, 2008, everybody gets interested in electronic cash again. This could be a thing, but electronic cash doesn't stand alone, right? It doesn't solve the fundamental problems as a single thing. You have to pair it to the rest of systems. You need things like identity. You need the ability to handle non-cash assets. You need the ability to buy and sell. You need marketplaces. So what happens with Bitcoin is Bitcoin works, but then you have to build a whole bunch of extensions around Bitcoin to make Bitcoin useful, and those then become the points at which you get interdiction. The exchanges wind up with problems with KYC. You wind up with hugely intrusive monitoring schemes on the chain itself, right? You know, it's a step towards something, but without, for example, ZK Snark technologies, it's hard to argue that Bitcoin provides the kind of privacy that you expect it to. Even though there are limitations on what Bitcoin offers, you still wind up in a position where the most powerful man in the world, officially, is talking about the tax starvation argument in 2016. So Tim May, who is some random dude off the internet who I think worked for Intel, makes the tax starvation argument in the Crypto Anarchist Manifesto. 22 years later, that's being answered by the most powerful man in the world. Does that sound like we're making progress towards something? Right? But this is clearly not a fight that we can win. Right? So we have to start thinking a little more strategically and a little more carefully about what are the fights that we can win and what are the fights that we have to avoid. Because we cannot get into a direct confrontation with the nation state about a lot of this core operational capability, because if we do, we're going to get squashed like bugs, and I want to point to the Tornado Cash thing as an example of that. What we need is a third way. We need a strategy which is not direct confrontation with the state and not capitulation to the nation state, but it allows us a zone of freedom where we can continue to operate and we continue to grow in a way that gets us most of what we want from the deal without having to try and get into a direct showdown with the feds, because nobody survives a direct showdown with the feds. So, as an example of this, right, the most recent situation with Biden, you know, everybody's expecting the ETFs are going to go, it's going to be great, it's going to be fantastic, everything's going to be fine. Turns out the ETFs are not going to go. Huge, huge, huge problems. So, what I want to suggest here is that we do not have to be in a position where we're fighting the power directly. The American government have a very confrontational attitude to this stuff. That is not true for the rest of the world. So I want to go back here to a set of slides that I delivered in Prague in 2014 that illustrates a different approach. The slides in red are the 2014 slides. Yeah, shiny, right? Shiny, those were the days. So what we proposed in 2018 was that there was a thing called a fiat asset, and the fiat assets were created by the state in the same way that crypto assets were created by cryptography. This model has borne out really well, right? Fiat assets controlled with fiat keys, fiat identity, that's just like house title. Crypto assets controlled with native keys, Ethereum, Bitcoin tokens. Crypto assets controlled with fiat identity, that's ETFs, custodial wallets, banks, custody, and crypto. And fiat assets controlled with crypto IDs, that is tokenized real world assets. Right? The model holds up. Fiat assets and crypto assets are different things, but you can bridge them. Similarly, we argued the blockchain was inevitable. turns out we're not the only people that think though. This argument was made from physics.
Серьезно?
This guy is the most senior judge in the UK for
ну
commercial
да, всё
law.
серьезно.
He's the person that decides civil dispute stuff at the highest level there is in Britain. Blockchain technology is unstoppable now, right? You know, will be adopted, will become ubiquitous in all major industrial and financial sectors because it allows for the immutable recording of data, reducing friction in commercial and consumer transactions, and obliterating the scope for dispute as to what has occurred. Now, does that sound like somebody that is hostile to the blockchain? I would say no, not hostile to the blockchain. So why are we getting such a different attitude from the American government and from the British judiciary? Right? Well, the answer is it solves a problem that they have, which is evidence management in cases. So if it solves a problem they have, they're interested in it. Similarly, this guy leads a project called the UK Jurisdiction Task Force. They make a thing called the Digital Dispute Resolution Rules. It's a set of rules for arbitrating disputes involving crypto assets. And it's about a 15-page legal document that really does a great job of figuring out what you need to do if you're going to be working with crypto assets in legal disputes. It's fantastic. Materium consulted on the creation of that document. We're the first company in the world to use it. So in the UK, there's a really strong base of support for doing stuff on the chain, right? It's not that we're locked into a single way that things can be. The political landscape that governs the blockchain is a complex thing with a lot of moving parts. Corporations, the state, and the people, it varies from place to place, it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So this whole notion that real-world assets were the future of the chain, in 2018, this was fantasy. But by the time you've got the legal machinery that's being set up in a whole bunch of different countries, in a whole bunch of different jurisdictions, that legal machinery begins to tie together the possibility of actually solving these problems, right? It's gone from way off in the future to right here, right now. So, for example, we speculated in the future you could take all of this world trade stuff and move it on chain. The enabling legislation called the UK Electronic Trade Documentation Act, ETDA, just passed this year, right? So this stuff is incredibly powerful. UK government says $280 billion a year of efficiency savings from using electronic trade documents. This stuff is mind-blowing, right? Similarly, Lord Mayor of London, head of the UK Financial Centre, shared ledgers, right? Digitization of assets and contracts, right? So in the UK, they've taken a completely different approach to the American approach. European Union, MiCA. A lot of people are afraid of MiCA. Do not be afraid of MiCA. MiCA levels the playing field, so there'll be a standard set of rules for crypto. And the fact that there's a lot of fighting in America about what the rules of crypto ought to be, and it's become politicized Democrat versus Republican, has nothing to do with what's going to happen with global crypto adoption. If the Americans continue to make a mess of that, if anything, it's going to accelerate crypto adoption in the EU, and the EU is still the largest economy in the world. So, what I want to suggest here is that we are not fighting government on all fronts. There is continuous haggling with the American government. The American government have always had a hard time with crypto going back 30 years. We should not expect them to change now. On the other hand, London is the largest financial center in the world. The EU is the world's largest economy. Both of those jurisdictions are doing just fine with crypto. Thank you very much. No problems there. So, final section of this, aligning global systems. So in the 1950s and 1960s, there was an incredibly powerful wave of globalization, largely driven by new technology in the form of things like data communications in its very earliest stages, telephony. It was all driven by this very early revolution in communications technology. I think maybe in the first communication satellites. Visa, founded in 1958, the idea was you had a single card that you could take anywhere in the world when you flew, and you could do transactions. At the time, this was thought of as being like a revolution in global finance, because it meant that you had one kind of money that could be used anywhere on Earth. It was mind-blowing, incredibly powerful, right? Similarly, gold, the oldest of technologies, right? At gold, there's no single country that produces it, there's no single country that consumes it. Gold is everywhere for everybody, for everything, and always has been. These are the global decentralized networks that already exist, and these are our natural allies. So there is a sweet spot between Ethereum, contract law under the 1958 convention, so that's standard international arbitration, and the globalized assets, right? Globalized assets is things like gold that do not have a single country of control. So if you think of like a US company, that is an asset that only exists in America, but if you think of real estate is everywhere. Literally, right? Anybody in the world that has real estate could then tokenize that real estate and potentially sell that real estate. This is a very, very powerful realization because it means that we're not relying on the laws inside of any one jurisdiction about whether or not you can tokenize stuff. If you can tokenize it anywhere, you can sell it everywhere because not all of the assets are contained inside of a simple local nation-state economy. We're not playing on a single playing field. We've got the entire world to pick from. So I want to conclude very quickly here, right? This is not just theory, right? I had, more than a decade working at the highest levels in government in a variety of roles in the UK and the US on things like cybersecurity. And I came to the Ethereum project with all of that knowledge and all of the kind of understanding of the long-term landscape that we were looking at that came from having moved through that world and contributed in that world. So when I took off in 2017 to start Materium, it was explicitly as a long-term political project to try and make sure that we could get mass adoption, we wouldn't get stuck in the same way that we'd gotten stuck in the 1990s. We know that you can generate trillions of dollars of wealth from cryptography. It's been done already. That was the e-commerce revolution. No little HTTPS padlock, no e-commerce, no Amazon, no Facebook, no Apple. This stuff is the core driver. What e-commerce did for retail, Ethereum could do for real estate. If there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this. There is no global electronic exchange for real estate, right? And the fact that there is no global electronic exchange for real estate is bizarre because there are global electronic exchanges for everything else, but real estate is the world's largest asset class. So if we get one thing right, and that's global electronic exchanges for real estate run on top of Ethereum, we are set for the next 50 years. That's pretty much the definition of victory. Real estate is the last truly epic asset class which has no electronic exchanges. The other thing is gold, right? It is possible to de-dollarize the Ethereum ecosystem, at which point the US government becomes 90% less annoyed with us, right? What they don't want is dollars bouncing off ZK snarks and then bouncing back into the fiat ecosystem because they lose control of the dollar, and nothing makes the American government more angry than losing control of its assets. So if we simply de-dollarize and we get rid of the dollars in the Ethereum ecosystem so that you just don't have USD anything tokens in that system, dramatically less friction with the Americans, you will get an attitude which is a bit more laissez-faire, because at the end of the day, we're not standing on their shoes. We've done a bunch of work on gold for years, specifically to try and create the opportunity to get away from the dollar ecosystem. And you've got to remember the gold ecosystem is globalized, right? It's Dubai, it's Hong Kong, it's Singapore, it's South Africa, it's Canada, right? All of these global centers for gold have their own law, their own regulation, their own jurisdiction, their own governance, their own rules. And any one of those jurisdictions could provide the necessary physical storage for enough gold to anchor as much stable coin as you wanted to issue. Same thing can potentially be done with real estate. The difference is it's very easy to value gold. It's very easy to audit gold. We do not need to be dependent on the dollar economy for stability in crypto assets. So this model, right, this long-term alignment on global systems, we've been working on that for years because it's only by aligning with the existing global systems that are already decentralized or partially decentralized that we get any kind of long-term prospect of victory. What we want to do is we want to get all of the components of a decentralized world working together. Contract law, global assets, and Ethereum. Final thing is, Just as a kind of gag, it's not just this world. So we've just announced a partnership with an outfit called Project Moonhat. Project Moonhat has probably the best shot right now of getting human habitation on the moon, and it's a very, very technically conservative project. They're not doing anything particularly new with technology. They're taking the same basic structures that you use in the International Space Station, but they're building them on the moon. Right? They've already got an enormous partner network towards that goal, including groups like Lockheed Martin. And what we're doing for those guys is getting involved in the whole process of managing the IP cross-licensing agreements between hundreds of commercial entities that are necessary to get this project done, but also to help manage the IP stream that comes out of that settlement. Right? And this is exactly the kind of high-profile stuff that if you pull off one or two of these on the blockchain, it's much, much, much less likely that anybody's going to give the technology a hard time just for existing. That was it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll be around after this if anyone has questions. Thank you.
When I request a wire, I don't share the reason for the transfer with the bank, because it has nothing to do with how wiring works. When I buy clothes online, I don't share my home address with the merchant. I'd rather share the address of the pickup station. We are born with the freedom to share our own information with whoever we want for the purposes we care about.
The other ways that I could see as a possible answer to that question. And finally, I ended up encountering psychology by chance. Actually, I was at a ski resort in Switzerland without any money to actually enjoy myself because the snow had melted and I didn't have money to go to a movie, but I found that reading the newspapers that there was to be a presentation by someone in a place that seemed in the center of Zurich, and it was about flying saucers. He was going to talk, and I thought, well, since I can't go to the movies, at least I will go for free to listen to flying saucers. And the man who talked at that evening lecture was very interesting, and it actually, instead of talking about little green man, he talked about how the psyche of the Europeans had been traumatized by the war, and now they are projecting flying saucers into the sky, kind of as a. He talked about how the mandalas of ancient Hindu religion were kind of projected into the sky as an attempt to regain some sense of order after the chaos of war. And this seemed very interesting to me, and I started reading his books after that lecture, and that was Carl Jung, whose name or work I had no idea about. Then I came to this country to study psychology, and I started trying to understand these roots of happiness. This is a typical result that many people have presented, and there are many variations on it. But this, for instance, shows that about 30% of the people surveyed in the United States since 1956 say that their life is very happy. And that hasn't changed at all, whereas the personal income on a scale that has been held constant to accommodate for inflation has more than doubled, almost tripled in that period. But you find essentially the same results, namely that after a certain basic point, which corresponds more or less to just a few $1,000s above the minimum poverty level, increases in material well-being don't seem to affect how happy people are. And in fact, you can find that the lack of basic resources, material resources, contributes to unhappiness, but
the increase in material resources do not increase happiness. So my research has been focused more on, after finding out these things that actually corresponded to my own experience, I tried to understand now where in everyday life, in our normal experience, do we feel really happy? And to start those studies about 40 years ago, I began to look at creative people, first artists and scientists and so forth, trying to understand what made them feel that it was worth essentially spending their life doing things for which many of them didn't expect either fame or fortune, but which made their life meaningful and worth doing. This was one of the leading composers of American music back in the 70s, and the interview was 40 pages long, but this little excerpt is a very good summary of what he was saying during the interview, and it describes how he feels when composing is going well. And he starts by describing it as an ecstatic state. Now, ecstasy in Greek meant simply to stand to the side of something. And then it became essentially an analogy for a mental state where you feel that you're not doing your ordinary everyday routines. So ecstasy is essentially a stepping into an alternative reality. And it's interesting if you think about it, how when we think about the civilizations that we look up to as having been pinnacles of human achievement, whether it's China, Greece, Hindu civilization, or the Mayas, or Egyptians, what we know about them is really about their ecstasies, not about their everyday life. We know the temples they built so where people could come to experience a different reality. We know about the circuses, the arenas, sport arenas, the theaters. These are the remains of civilizations, and they are the places that people went to experience life in a more concentrated, more ordered form. Now, this man doesn't need to go to a place like this, which is also, this place, this arena, which is built like a Greek amphitheater, is a place for ecstasy also. We are participating in a reality which is different from that of everyday life that we're used to. But this man doesn't need to go to there. He needs just a piece of paper where he can put down little marks, and as he does that, he can imagine sounds that had not existed before in that particular combination. So once he gets to that point of beginning to create, like Jennifer did in her improvisation, a new reality, that is a moment of ecstasy. He enters that different reality. Now, he says also that this is so intense an experience that it feels almost as if it didn't exist. And that sounds like a kind of a romantic exaggeration, but actually our nervous system is incapable of processing more than about 110 bits of information per second. And in order to hear me and understand what I'm saying, you need to process about 60 bits per second. That's why you can't hear more than two people. You can't understand more than two people talking to you. Well, when you are really involved in this completely engaging process of creating something new, as this man does, he doesn't have enough attention left over to monitor how his body feels or his problems at home. He can't feel even that he's hungry or tired. His body disappears, his identity disappears from his consciousness because he doesn't have enough attention, like none of us do, to really do well something that requires a lot of concentration and at the same time to feel that he exists. So existence temporarily suspended. And he says that his hand seems to be moving by itself. Now, I could look at my hand for 2 weeks and I wouldn't feel any awe or wonder because I can't compose. But so what he's not telling you here, but in other parts of the interview, is that obviously this automatic, spontaneous process that he's describing can only happen to someone who is very well trained and who has developed technique. And it has become a kind of a truism in the study of creativity that you can't be creating anything with less than 10 years of technical knowledge, immersion in a particular field. Whether it's mathematics or music, it takes that long to be able to begin to change something in a way that it's better than what was there before. Now, when that happens, he says, the music just flows out. And because all of these people I started interviewing, this was an interview which is over 30 years old, so many of the people describe this as a spontaneous flow that I call this type of experience the flow experience. And it happens in different realms. For instance, a poet describes it in this form. This is by a student of mine who interviewed some of the leading writers and poets in the United States, and it describes the same effortless, spontaneous feeling that you get when you enter into this ecstatic state. This poet describes it as opening a door that floats up in the sky. Very similar description to what Albert Einstein gave as to how he imagined the forces of relativity when he was struggling with trying to understand how it worked. But it happens in other activities. For instance, this is another student of mine, Susan Jackson from Australia, who did work with some of the leading athletes in the world. And you see here in this description of an Olympic skater, the same essential description of the phenomenology of the inner state of the person. You don't think it goes automatically. You merge yourself with the music and so forth. It happens also actually in the most recent book I wrote called Good Business, where I interviewed some of the CEOs who have been nominated by their peers as being both very successful and very ethical, very socially responsible. You see that these people define success as something that helps others and at the same time makes you feel happy as you are working at it. And like all of these successful and responsible CEOs say, you can't have just one of these things to be successful. If you want a meaningful job and successful job, Anita Roddick is another one of these CEOs we interviewed. She is the founder of Body Shop, the cosmetic, kind of natural cosmetic thing. It's kind of a passion that comes from doing the best and having fun while you're working. This is an interesting little quote from Masaru Ibuka, who was, at that time, starting out Sony without any money, without a product. They didn't have product, they didn't have anything, but they had an idea. And the idea he had was to establish a place of work where engineers can feel the joy of technological innovation, be aware of their mission to society,
looking this AI,
and work to their heart's
you have finance that wants
to improve on this as a
to build
good
a
example
Dyson
of
sphere.
how flow enters the workplace. Now, when we do studies, we have, with other colleagues around the world, done over 8,000 interviews of people, from Dominican monks to blind nuns to Himalayan climbers to Navajo shepherds who enjoy their work. And regardless of the culture, regardless of education or whatever, there are these 7 conditions that seem to be there when a person is in flow. It's this focus that once it becomes intense, leads to a sense of ecstasy, a sense of clarity. You know exactly what you want to do from one moment to the other. You get immediate feedback. You know that what you need to do is possible to do even though difficult. And sense of time disappears. You forget yourself. You feel part of something larger. And once those conditions are present, what you're doing becomes worth doing for its own sake. In our studies, we represent the everyday life of people in this simple scheme, and we can measure this very precisely, actually, because we give people electronic pagers that go off 10 times a day, and whenever they go off, you say what you're doing, how you feel, where you are, what you're thinking about. And 2 things that we measure is the amount of challenge people experience at that moment and the amount of skills that they feel they have at that moment. So for each person, we can establish an average, which is the center of the diagram. That would be your mean level of challenge and skill, which will be different from that of anybody else. But you have a kind of a set point there, which would be in the middle. If we know what that set point is, we can predict fairly accurately when you will be in flow, and it will
indicate that you will need to make sure that you're in good health, or if you are not, to make sure that you don't do anything that could make your state of health worse than better. And that will, of course, depend on your ability to be rational, objective about what's happening health-wise. But once again, when I talk about health, it's not just an health as such. It can be health in any area of your life. So if you know of an area that may need particular attention to deal with an issue, then you will have to take that into consideration and not make things worse than they really are. So remain, thanks to Saturn, you may most probably be able to do that. Remain as objective and passionate as possible. That will make a difference for sure. Yes, after the moon transits in Leo, as you can see here, as soon as it enters in Leo, it triggers the energy of Pluto, which is the energy of regeneration. So, what is it that you need to regenerate? Maybe something, but you are going to regenerate in some way, your own body, your cells, your organs are going to regenerate. And the power of Pluto in this sign, Aquarius, is going to last for 20 years. Because it is here in an air sign, which is where actually the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and Jupiter are, Pluto is in harmony with all that. And being in harmony with all that, it helps regenerating the energy produced by the planets. So it's not a planet, it's a star, it's house. All the other planets, they transits through Leo. But this one is going to remain. And that's a strong one. Jupiter is concerned. Jupiter, growth, progress, success. Is it what you want? Maybe it's what you can achieve on that day, or at least things will come into play, and then you can organize what will become a success. Then the moon carries on, and it's going to carry on through Leo and carry on through Virgo, and eventually reach the black moon here, 28 degrees in Virgo. So the black moon is toward the end of the sign Virgo, and after that it's going to transit through Libra for about 9 months. So here the moon is going to trigger the energy of the black moon, but it's also going to trigger the energy of Saturn and Neptune on that particular day, which is the 14th of June. And the conjunction occurs at 3 p.m. And 3 p.m. is universal time, of course, but the energy of the moon will be felt much, much earlier than that. I would say already toward the end of the 13th of June, the energy of the moon is going to be strong and becomes stronger and stronger as time goes by. So,
come and hold my hand. I wanna contact the living. Not sure I understand this role I've been given. I sit and talk to God, and He just laughs at my plan. My head speaks a language I don't understand. I just wanna feel real love, feel the home that I live in. 'Cause I got too much life running through my veins, going to waste.